when
This
we have
conference will now be recorded.
we table these until the next meeting and we can approve 2 sets when we have more of the committee present. That's okay with everyone?
Aye.
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 Perfect. So that takes us to the meat of the discussion. The 2023, FY 2023 comp plan, the budget and targets. And so just walking through what the overall plan is today. So typically we split our budget process with the committee into 3 meetings. The first meeting, we usually talk about targets and revenues. The next one, expenses. The third one is where we tie everything together. We look at the cash flows. We look at what the impact is onto the balance sheet. And then we look for the committee to make a recommendation at that third meeting, which will be June 15th. This year we are getting a little bit of a later start for the first meeting, but that's not going to really impact our schedule. That's just more due to some administrative things that we needed to dot our I's and cross our T's with from a staff perspective in terms of doing these targets. But they are well thought out, and I'm looking forward to walking through those with the committee today. So, Green Bank from results to date. So we've now been in existence, what is this now, 11 years. So the first 10 years, we delivered 56,000 projects, just shy of our cumulative target of 57,000. We deployed 2.29, almost $2.3 billion worth of capital. We beat our target for capital deployment. In terms of installed capacity, we delivered 490 megawatts out of a cumulative target of 517. So looking at the last full fiscal year we had, which was fiscal year 2021, we delivered 7,000 projects out of a target of 5,100. So we had a much more successful first year of COVID than we had initially thought we might. We delivered $268 million of investment out of a target of 175 million, and 66 megawatts of capacity installed for out of a target of 48 megawatts. This year, so far, year to date, and this goes through for most things about the end of April, just based off of when we get data. We have delivered 3,100 projects, close to 3,200 projects out of 3,400. We've delivered $99 million worth of capital deployed out of 128 million, and 20 megawatts out of 36 megawatts in terms of the capacity target. Our big milestone this year is we've squarely passed the 50,000 number in terms of projects completed. We've continued past that 2.2 billion or that 2 billion number. So we're continuing to make great progress, and I think that we are going to get even closer to these targets. We have a couple of larger projects that will hopefully close by the end of the year. The board has been updated on a couple, so aren't in that number. So that's just to set the stage for what do we say we're actually going to do for the next year. So as an organization, as you're well aware, we're split between our financing programs and our incentive programs. On the financing side, we are looking to do 878 projects for $62 million worth of investment. We're setting a target around 7 megawatts of capacity. And on the incentive side, we're looking at doing 1,400 projects, between 1,400 and 1,500, for $34 million worth of investment, which should be about 7.8 megawatts of capacity. I want to highlight here that our targets going forward are going to be smaller. that we don't have the RSIP, which really drove up both capacity numbers and investment numbers and project numbers. That the program hit its target, it's sunsetted. We're in the process of wind down and asset management for it. So in terms of new projects, the real growth is going to be seen in battery storage, but that's a 10-year program, and we're a little bit slower on the uptake at the moment. So the other thing that I want to highlight, and I'll talk about this more in depth as we get to the financing programs, is with regard to our capacity targets. In the past, we've typically, actually going way back to when I first joined, we used to set a target around efficiency in MMBTUs and a target around renewable generation capacity installed in megawatts. We ultimately decided that it was pretty hard to estimate how much energy savings would be delivered. And we backed away and stopped doing an MMBTU target. And ultimately, what we're doing here is we're saying, look, the capacity, by just having a capacity target on renewable energy, we're creating a little bit of a perverse incentive where we're incentivizing people to go or we're incentivizing staff to spend more time on renewable energy than energy efficiency. So we're taking that out on programs that are doing both, or at least on CPACE, and I'll talk about in a second. So speaking of CPACE, here we are. So financing programs, as I mentioned, we're doing 882 projects for $64 million and 7.6 megawatts of capacity. And it was the CPACE world that really led us to revisit the capacity targets and remove that there. We're still expect to deliver on par with where we are today in terms of number of projects and in terms of the capital deployment of those projects, but we don't have a good way of gauging how much of those are going to be solar versus how much of those are going to be efficiency. And so we haven't set a target. We are going to go back and look at historically what's been done, and is there a better way for us to gauge, to put together a capacity target going forward. We just haven't come up with that methodology prior to doing these targets. So any questions on that? So moving on.
Sorry, Eric, I do.
Sorry.
Could you go back into the background of that a little bit? I'm probably, I'm not remembering that we had this discussion before, and I don't know what's the background story of not being able to estimate the difference between the what we're delivering in terms of energy efficiency and what we're delivering in terms of solar or other. I guess we're going to have battery storage now too. So what's the difference? I mean, why is it so critical in CPACE? We have a trouble breaking that down, whereas we've accepted the breakdown in other areas.
So it's because CPACE is one of the few programs that we have that really focuses on energy efficiency and solar. So it's basically, it's CPACE and Smarty where we really have programs that are operating for both purposes. Within the CPACE world, it's rare that we're going to a building owner and saying, hey, why don't you do X here? It's projects are coming to us from a contractor or a developer or a larger property owner that are already pretty well baked. And in terms of we don't have a lot of influence over what gets done. We can lobby to say, hey, if you're doing X, you may want to make sure you're doing Y, but we don't have a lot of influence to say, hey, do solar versus do efficiency, or it's something's coming to us, and it's kind of out of our control what type of projects come to us in terms of solar versus efficiency. So it's been kind of harder for us to estimate the proportions of what's solar versus what's efficiency. Whereas if we're looking at the PPA, that's straight up, it's a very linear progression or a linear forecast where we know how many projects are going to get done. We know what's in our pipeline from a map and a state solar perspective. From the ZREC auctions, we know the sizes of those, so we can estimate that capacity. In terms of CPACE, we haven't been as good in terms of our forecasts haven't been as good from a capacity perspective. So we're just
in terms of the past, are you saying that in terms of the past, we don't have enough of a track record to know what the breakdown might be?
I wouldn't say that we have enough, it's a track record. I would just say that our track record on forecasting what that breakdown is going to be is not that great. We have, it's just, there's so much variability that's out of our control that we're looking at overall, if we convert everything, savings and generation capacity to a single MMBTU number, is that indicative of what's going to happen? Is there something across the board that we could do? So it's kind of, we have our hands around kind of the amount that we think we can deliver from an investment perspective and in a numbers perspective. It's just that mix that we have been kind of hard to predict. And so we're trying to figure out a way to boil that down to a common denominator.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Well, we're looking forward to seeing that because it's half of the budget.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Eric, I just want to follow up on what Adrienne was saying. I mean, I've noticed in some of the, actually it's come back to me with some questions of some of the projects suddenly subcontract elements to other companies we didn't know were in the game. And I'm just wondering if we're getting a handle on who these players are or might be, because obviously it's the Wild West out there when you think about, you know, it's an evolving industry with all kinds of new players. But are we getting a better sense of that? Because that feels like that's part of the forecasting equation, is to kind of know who does what and what they're likely to do. So
from so I mean, for all of our programs, we have a pretty robust and ever evolving and becoming more stringent contractor approval process. In terms of subcontracting, let me come back to you on that in terms of what is allowed and where and how much. Like, I think we have good visibility on what's going on. I'm not plugged into each program enough to know what's actually being allowed to be subcontracted and what's not. I do know that in many respects we have quality has our attention just based off of some prior experiences, I'll say. But yeah, if you don't mind, Madam Chair, can I follow up with you on that?
Oh, absolutely. And you know, and it's just talking about the Woodbridge JCC and how we had to revisit every element of that. And I was very surprised at how many players there suddenly were and that we didn't know about, you know, so I'm just wondering if we can tighten that up again.
Certainly.
Thanks.
And as I mentioned, we have making sure that we have a robust contractor approval process works. It has a lot of focus from us. I mean, the JCC was certainly a learning experience where we can standardize things across the board. I think there's an opportunity to do that. That'll make things ultimately easier for our contracting partners, but also help us mitigate some risk and just manage our contractor fleet a little bit better. So I'll circle back with you later today on that. From a PPA perspective, our target is based of 19 projects is based off of what's in the pipeline from MAP and from the state, as well as there's some room for third-party developed projects that or ones that we end up developing ourselves. SBEA, we're expecting to do the utilities to bring another 839 39 loans for 18 million. which those are what's currently backing our Green Liberty note. So it's great to see that we have a continued pipeline there. Multifamily pre-development, we are not forecasting anything there. We are looking at 6 projects from a multifamily term or PPA perspective. And that is based off of what's on the existing pipeline and a couple of things that have been in the works for a couple of years at least. And also just our renewed efforts to push the PPA in the multifamily space with the recent policy changes at PURA, allowing them to avail themselves of residential rates. So, and then we have one health and safety project that is something that is in that has been in the hopper for a little bit of time. Transportation, we are continuing with the carbon offset monetization, and there are a couple other things in the works. The carbon offsets will be included in the overall impact targets for the organization, as we won't really count them as projects or capital or capacity, but they are reducing carbon emissions, and they're providing an income stream to us. So those will be in the overall numbers. And then in terms of strategic investments, we have not put together a number right now, but as you all know, Bert will undoubtedly be bringing us something at some point. The Groton fuel cell hopefully will close this year, but that could ultimately roll into this bucket for next fiscal year. And then there are a couple other things in the works as well. Any questions here? All right, so moving on. So to the incentive business. And the biggest thing to note here out of these 1,400 projects is there's no RSUP. So the RSUP hit its 350 megawatt statutory cap. We had that additional space for the RSUP extension, and that has been achieved. The program has effectively been closed to new applicants for some time now, and we are in project completion and wind down phase. So that's the biggest difference here versus prior years. For ESS, Energy Storage Solutions, I'm going to break that down into 2 parts. First is the CI&I, the commercial, industrial, and institutional portion, which has a separate PURA target from the residential portion. So the first thing you'll see is 0 projects and for this year, and that gets at how we're counting projects. So for every other program that we've had, when a loan closes or the documents are signed, we count it. We don't count it into our impact numbers until it actually completes, but in terms of what we set for our targets for the year, closing has been what we use towards that. For Energy Storage Solutions, because of the lead time, because of where the impact really is and kind of how we're being judged in terms of dispatch, we're really looking at using the project completion, so much further in the process, to around those targets, and to count something towards them. So this is basically us saying is we have a huge pipeline full of, we've actually had more applications than there is capacity on the CI&I side. But even if we greenlight all of those projects today, we don't expect them to be online and complete this fiscal year. It's just going to take more time to get the batteries in, get the interconnection permits done, get the utilities happy, and get this dispatching. So I think we are hopeful that some of those will be up and running for next summer's dispatch season. But we're saying that we don't expect them for anything this fiscal year. On the residential side, we are saying that we can do 500 projects. $20 million worth of investment in 7.6 megawatts of nameplate battery capacity, which we think is doable. We have seen, admittedly, a slower uptake as installers are figuring out how do they sell batteries, supply chain impacts on everything, but we do think this is doable, and we do see installers in the market starting to ramp up. The final program here on the incentive programs is SMART-E. And our SMART-E targets of 960 projects for about $15 million. So this encompasses both energy efficiency and solar. Solar has typically been close to between 5 and 10% the past 2 years of projects. We're pushing, the loan can still be used for solar, but we've been really pushing other technologies, such as heat pumps and batteries and other things we've had the special offers going for. And that's what we're going to be doing again this following year, is a special offer, most likely around renewable heating and cooling. So that's kind of how we get that number and how we're still retaining a capacity target. It's based off of that, just much more linear forecast for solar. In terms of, we've also talked with the deployment committee, we talked certainly at the strategic retreat about the use of SMART-E for environmental infrastructure. And these targets are based on, are not based on doing that. They're based strictly on the program as it exists today for clean energy. There's still miles to go before we sleep and roll out SMART-E for environmental infrastructure in terms of, I think we have some good ideas about what the measures are that we would offer, but I think it's officially defining what those measures are. So what exactly is a well replacement versus what exactly is, I don't even know the specifics enough to, but we need to build those definitions, and we need to build a contractor base. So if and when the board approves of an expansion of SMART-E for specific environmental infrastructure measures, that we'll consider targets at that time if they need to be adjusted based off of that. Questions or concerns on incentive targets?
No questions, but just a comment about that last piece you mentioned in defining environmental projects. I think it would be a good idea to take a look at what the municipal governments are going to be doing with their ARPA funds around environmental projects, residential projects. I shared earlier that the town of Bloomfield sent a survey out to residents asking folks' opinions about how to spend the ARPA dollars, and water infrastructure was one of those options. And I thought that that was a really great idea as it responds to the number of households that have to deal with flooding every time there's a heavy rain. So just wanted to share that as a recommendation.
It's a very good point. I know that there's been a lot of community-based, community-sourced ideas around those ARPA dollars. And I think looking at how those are getting spent, I think is a great idea.
Yep.
All right, so why don't we shift gears for a sec and move to over to the revenue side of the budget. So in terms of the budget, I'll start with the biggest thing first, which is the biggest source of revenue are the utility customer receipts from the Clean Energy Fund, which is that $1 million that's tacked onto every electric bill. Those are forecast to come down 1% year on year. Based off of economic activity, it's based off of the fund doing its job, so providing more efficiency to the system. It's also based off of economic conditions and just overall forecasts from the utilities and Jane and Bert and where we see this going. And this is in line with what we've seen in the past several years, is just about a 1% annual decrease in this. The next item is with regard to the RGGI auction proceeds. And the Green Bank receives 23% of the proceeds from the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. So they auction off their tradable discharge permits on a quarterly basis. We get a certain percent, or we get that 23% of those proceeds. We're forecasting a 22% increase, and that's based off of the recent increase in demand for permits and the higher clearing prices. So there's both an increase in supply and an increase in terms of demand. So you end up having more available at a higher price, so which has benefited us. The one item that I do want to note is what was Senate bill for the Clean Air Act has provided for the redirection of excess RGGI proceeds to fund clean hydrogen and alternative fuel vehicles in the state. So it's any proceeds over a specific dollar amount, which I believe is about 5.2 million a year, will be redirected to the state, but that begins in the way that I read the bill in fiscal year 2024. But having had a conversation with Brian Farnan this morning, where he's still reviewing with council about when to expect that impact. So the short version is, don't worry about it for this year. It's either FY24 or FY25 based on the bill. So questions on that? Interest income. So year on year, we have a slight decrease. And that's really driven by some projects paying off early. That, you know, we allow our buyers to pay down their loans, which unfortunately reduces our interest income. But the other big driver here is we had expected the Groton fuel cell to close much earlier in this fiscal year and already be paying us interest income, and it has yet to close. So again, we're hopeful that that closes in the next 6 weeks. It may carry over to next fiscal year, but at some point we ultimately will start receiving that interest income, but it is causing us to have slightly lower income than forecasted. In terms of grant income, we're expecting to be flat year on year. I mean, yes, there could be things that come out of the federal government in terms of if anything ever happens on Build Back Better or on the infrastructure bill. There could be things, but we haven't included any in the budget at this point. So the next item I really want to highlight to you guys is around our REC sales. So we have the RECs that we inherited from the Connecticut Clean Energy Fund and from the early years of RSIP that we're not able to track, and we sell at market prices. We also have the RECs from the RSIP extension, which are not trackable. So our staff actively follows the REC markets. We're tracking the prices. We're looking for opportunities. We've currently locked in prices for the next couple of years at a weighted average price of $30.17. Last year, our average price for our forward contracts was $19. So you can see that's almost, it's a little above a 30% increase. Also, the number of RECs that we've produced year on year has increased by about 22%. And that's, so we're having a good year in terms of non-Shrek RECs. In terms of Shrek RECs, we are forecasting those based off of the systems that have come online what the official forecasts are from those systems as produced by our independent engineer as part of our securitizations. This is going up year on year, and that's due to the fact that we have new systems coming online. And so, yeah, so overall, I think we're in a pretty good place revenue-wise year on year. And we certainly have the capital to achieve the targets we've set for it. So, which is the main message I wanted to convey here. Now we need to go out and figure out how we're going to spend the money to get there in terms of expenses. But are there any questions or concerns at this point?
Eric, when we go through the actual numbers on revenue for each of these posts, could you just highlight what the percentages of the overall revenues? For instance, looking at this and not having the other numbers next to it, I'm not sure, what the impact is of the Reggie point, for instance, or the fact that you're going to have increased direct sales. How much of a boost is that going to be given the percentage of our revenues that it represents?
Absolutely. Let me just pull that up on the screen.
Okay.
Oops. Sorry, somehow that just closed on me.
Eric, do you mind if I jump in?
Oh, certainly. Go for it, Dan.
I'm Dan Smith, Associate Director of Financial Reporting. I work under Jane and helped put this together. And just roughly, the utility customer receipts are about 40% of total revenues.
Mhm.
The Reggie are about 20%. The Shrek sales are about 20%. And then the rec sales number is much smaller, maybe 2 or 3% of total revenues.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
So yeah, everything here is on the screen. You can see the order of magnitude that are the utility customer receipts is over twice the amount that we get from Reggie.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the interest income is about 50% of what we're getting from Reggie. Our spec sales are about equivalent to the Reggie, so another 20%.
20%, right.
Yeah. So hats off to Dan. He did a great job of putting the budget together. But also has much better mental math skills than I do.
You mean his adding machine is faster?
Oh, much. So, yeah, and I mean, just to highlight the interest income numbers is what we're really focused on, especially within the financing programs businesses, in terms of how are our goal is to increase that so that we're covering expenses from that interest income. So, does that get to your question, Adrian?
Yes, it does, absolutely. It's just that when we're talking about one slide, we can't see the other slide, so it's
Totally. I take on that feedback, and I will. I'll make sure we have some better charts that show that breakdown at the next meeting. And
That's fine. That's fine. We've overcome, no problem.
All right. Well, this I've moved relatively quickly through the deck that I had for today. And I realized that we still have 40 minutes on the clock, so I don't want to waste your valuable time, but I'm also open to any questions or concerns that you might have or things that you would like to be highlighted ahead of in the next meeting on expenses.
I do have one thought, but it does, it's both revenue and expenses. It's hard for me to understand where we could push the most to change anything. So, I mean, you made some comments about that as we went through. Is there a way to maybe highlight where, yeah, the team judgment is what's going to either increase or decrease, where we want to put our efforts, or where, the state budget and other outside factors are, weigh so heavily that it's going to be hard for the team to change anything. So there may be some indications to us and the rest of the board as to what some of the objectives might be in terms of pushing one source of revenue rather than the other. Something might be immutable and something might be just a bit more changeable if we had our druthers.
So just here, so from a utility customer assessments, from there, there's nothing that we can do to impact that, aside from just doing what is naturally our part in terms of helping the economy in Connecticut. The more the economy grows, the more that this number will increase, but at the same time, if we're doing our job on efficiency, it shouldn't be increasing that much, or it should be increasing at a decreasing rate. From a Reggie perspective, absolutely nothing that we can do. And in fact, there's now this new cap on that that'll kick in a couple of years. So nothing for staff to expend their efforts on. Interest income is absolutely something that we can impact. And the more that we are focused on closing projects that are producing income streams for us, the better off we are in future years. And that's been one of our areas of more heightened focus since the legislative sweeps going back to, what was that, FY18, and it will continue to be. I think that we're still refining the ways that we encourage staff to prioritize that, but yeah, I mean, that's the area where I think we can impact the budget the most. Moving on, grant income, it depends on what and where. I think so a lot of it is heavy lifts. Sometimes, and it depending on what it is, may depend on what the reward is. I think that right now there's a lot of opportunity out there through the infrastructure bill and potentially through Build Back Better if anything happens there. We're working with, we have a couple of meetings of exploring how we can avail ourselves of some of those infrastructure dollars, and we're coordinating with the state. So yeah, there is a way that we could impact that. It's probably further down the road. We don't have a lot of, we don't have a good line of sight to what that number is, but it's out there. We are putting effort towards it. But I wouldn't say that staff as a whole aren't working towards getting those grants. It's a much smaller group. In terms of both rec sales and Shrek sales, that's an area where we absolutely have a lot of impact over our budget, and that is an area that's near and dear to my heart, and near and dear to a lot of the efforts that we're working on right now in terms of just expanding our asset management capabilities. We're working, examining the tools that we currently have in place, looking at other ways to source data, and then implementing new processes. The more that we're on top of our fleet of systems and resolving underperformance issues and making sure that everything's up and communicating and working with third-party system owners, the more that we're going to hit this target. I don't see, it's not like we're going to create more sunlight and create more generation, but there's a lot more of a downside than there is a huge upside that we could push this. And so I think that we've built the groundwork for this. I think there's still some more work to be done before we're really where I think I would be happy with it. But yeah, if you want to talk about staff influence, that's certainly a place where we can influence the outcomes. And the rest of these are all much smaller categories. CPACE closing fees is clearly driven off of the number of loans that we close. So yeah, the more that we close, the more that we're going to get there. It's not a huge chunk of change, but it is there. In terms of PPA income, again, the more that we close, the more that we're going to have, where oftentimes those are just projects that are sitting on our books until they get monetized and sold somewhere else. So yeah, we can, the more that we do, the more that we influence it, the more that we're going to have, but it's not a long-term income stream. It's more of a, let's hold it until we move it to find a long-term home for it. And then in terms of LREC and ZREC income, again, that's kind of with the PPA projects before they find a permanent home. So, does that help address your question?
Yes, I think it helps us as a bank to address the question of how we can grow our operations.
As a bank, yeah, need to do more loans.
Thank you.
All right. Other questions or concerns? All right, well, if you'd like, we can give you some time back in your day if there's a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
I second.
I guess we're all in favor.
Well, thank you all for your time this morning, and I look forward to meeting again in a couple weeks.
Thanks so much, Eric.
Thanks, Eric.
Thank you.
Bye,
Take care.
everybody.
Bye.